moment my mother-in-law raised her glass and said, "We just want to thank our daughter-in-law for making all of this possible," I felt something in my chest go very, very still. Not grateful, not moved, still, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm decides what it wants to be. My name is Quinn. I'm 31 years old. I'm a project manager at a mid-sized logistics firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I have spent the last 4 years being the financial engine of a family that never once bothered to look under the hood. Let me back up. My husband and I got married young by most people's standards. I was 27, he was 29, and we were both convinced we had figured out something most couples hadn't. We talked about money before we got married. We made a budget. We had the conversation about kids and careers and who would do what and when. I genuinely thought we were the exception. What I didn't account for was his family. His mother is a woman who confuses generosity with obligation and gratitude with access. She's not cruel in an obvious way. She doesn't yell. She doesn't insult you directly. She works in suggestions and implication, in the kind of warmth that comes with invisible strings already attached. She moved to Charlotte 3 years ago, right after his father passed, and I was the one who helped coordinate the move. I found her apartment. I helped her set up utilities. I took 3 days off work to help her unpack. She told everyone at church I was like a second daughter to her. What she didn't tell anyone was that she'd already started treating my bank account like a family trust she'd been named executor of. It started small. A grocery run here, a copay there. My husband would mention it casually, the way you mentioned the weather. Mom needed help with her car registration this month. $63. Fine. Mom's AC unit went out. I said we'd look into it. We ended up paying for the repair. $842. Still fine, I told myself. She's family. She's alone. She just lost her husband. But then the asks started coming faster than the explanations. By the time I noticed the pattern, we were 18 months in. I had been folding her expenses into ours so quietly that I'd almost convinced myself it was voluntary. The truth was, I didn't want to be the woman who said no to a grieving widow. I didn't want my husband to have to choose. I didn't want to be the reason anyone in that family looked at me differently. So I kept saying yes, and silence, I eventually learned, is the most expensive thing a person can offer. The trip came up in February. My husband mentioned it on a Tuesday night, casual as anything, while I was reviewing contracts at the kitchen table. He sat down across from me with that specific kind of careful posture that meant he'd already decided something and was now figuring out how to present it. His mother, he said, had always wanted to see the Pacific Northwest. It had been a dream of hers and his father's that never happened. His sister, who lives up in Virginia, had been talking with their mom about doing a trip together as a family, a week in Oregon, Portland, the coast, Crater Lake maybe. He said it like he was describing someone else's vacation. That sounds nice, I said. They were thinking we could all go together, he said. I looked up. How many people? He listed them, his mother, his sister and her boyfriend, his cousin who I had met exactly twice, his aunt from Raleigh, and us. 7 people, 1 week, Oregon. And how would that work financially? I asked. He hesitated just long enough. Mom was thinking we could put it on the joint card and kind of settle up after. I set my pen down. The joint card. The one I'd funded almost entirely for the past 2 years because his freelance income had been inconsistent. The one I monitored and reconciled every month. The one that his mother had never once contributed to but had benefited from in ways I was still calculating. How much are we talking? I asked. He had a number ready. He'd been thinking about this longer than tonight. It was just over $4,000. Our share, he called it. I remember the word specifically. Our share. As if the other 5 adults were going to walk in and divide the rest evenly among themselves, as if this had already been negotiated without me in the room, as if our share was a fixed and reasonable thing that a reasonable wife would simply agree to. I said I needed to think about it. He smiled like that meant yes. It always had before. That night, I opened my laptop and did something I had been avoiding for months. I made a real accounting. Not the surface budget I kept for us, the clean version with the grocery categories and the car payment and the savings transfers. I went deeper. I pulled every transaction from the joint account for the past 18 months and I tagged them. Every restaurant where his mother joined us and the bill somehow ended up on our card. Every pharmacy charge that wasn't ours. Every Venmo transfer to his account labeled Miss that I now understood as a relay point. The number I arrived at was not small. Across 18 months, between direct expenses, reimbursed costs that were never actually reimbursed, and contributions I had made to his mother's household under the category of family support, I had spent or transferred just over $11,000. Not savings, not bonus money. $11,000 from my regular take-home pay absorbed so quietly into our life that I had half convinced myself it was just the cost of being married into a family with needs. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I started making a second list. The beach house his family rented last summer for the 4th of July weekend. I had paid for the groceries and the fireworks and the boat rental because his mother had said she'd cover the rental, and then mentioned once we arrived that the security deposit had been bigger than expected. I paid it, $2,200. Nobody brought it up again. The birthday dinner for his mother's 63rd birthday at a steakhouse downtown where 8 people ordered whatever they wanted, and somehow by the time the check came, it had migrated in front of me, $412. The Christmas gift his mother had picked out for his sister's kids because, as she put it, she didn't have the energy that year and she knew I was good at these things. I spent $380 on children I see twice a year, wrapped everything, wrote the cards. His mother gave them out and didn't mention me once. I wasn't angry while I made the list. That surprised me. I expected to feel rage, and instead I felt something quieter and more clarifying, like adjusting the focus on a lens you've been squinting through for years. I didn't say anything to my husband that night. I closed the laptop, went to bed, lay in the dark, and listened to him breathe and thought about all the ways I had made myself easy to use without ever being asked. The trip planning moved forward without my confirmation. 2 weeks later, his mother texted me directly, which she rarely did. She said she was so excited about Oregon and that she'd been looking at this one resort on the coast, and could I take a look and let her know what I thought. She attached a link. It was a 4-star property. The nightly rate was $380. I looked up a link for a long time. Then I put my phone down and called my financial advisor. I had been meaning to restructure some accounts for a while. I made the appointment. I also called a friend of mine from college who had gone to law school and now practices family law in Charlotte. I told her what was happening, the full version, not the version I'd been telling myself. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she told me 2 things. First, that what had been happening was a pattern with a name. Second, that I had more options than I was probably aware of. We talked for an hour. I took notes. The dinner where everything became visible happened on a Saturday in March. His mother had invited the whole extended family, 12 people, to her apartment for what she called a planning dinner for the Oregon trip. She made her pot roast, the kind she's made for 30 years that everyone compliments like it's a magic trick. The table was crowded and warm and loud in the way his family's gatherings always are, everyone talking over everyone else, his aunt refilling wine glasses before they're empty. I sat at the table and I smiled and I passed the bread and I listened. About an hour in, after the main course and before the dessert his sister had brought, his mother stood up. She tapped her glass. The table went quiet the way tables do when a matriarch signals she has something to say. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about how much the trip meant to her, how his father had always wanted to see the Oregon coast, how she knew he was looking down on all of them. A few people teared up. His aunt reached across and squeezed her hand. Then she turned to me. "And I especially want to thank Quinn," she said, warm as a radiator. "This girl has been a backbone of this family since the day she joined it. We are so lucky to have someone so capable and so generous." She smiled at me. The room smiled at me. Oregon would not be happening without her. Applause. Actual applause. My husband was beaming. I looked around the table and understood exactly what had just happened. I had been publicly enrolled, credited in front of witnesses in a way that made refusal retroactive, that made setting limits now look like a reversal, like pettiness, like taking something back that I had already given. It was elegant, honestly. I could see the architecture of it clearly now that I was looking. I raised my glass. "To clarity," I said, And I smiled the same way she had, because I think there are a few things about the trip we should all get on the same page about before we start booking. The warmth at the table flickered just slightly. "What do you mean?" his sister asked. "Just logistics," I said pleasantly. "I want to make sure everyone's comfortable with how costs will be divided before anything goes on anyone's card. I'd love to put together a shared spreadsheet so it's all transparent." His mother laughed softly. "Quinn, honey, we're family. We'll figure it out." "We will," I agreed. "That's why I want to write it down." Nobody said anything for a moment. My husband looked at me the way he had looked at me on the drive home from his mother's apartment months ago, like I had introduced a smell into the room that he didn't know how to account for. His aunt changed the subject. Dessert came out. The conversation moved on, but something had shifted at that table and everyone felt it and nobody named it. On the drive home, my husband said I had made things weird. I said I had asked a reasonable question. He said his mother was just trying to celebrate the trip. I said she was doing more than that. He said I was being ungenerous. I remember looking at the highway and thinking about the word ungenerous, thinking about $11,000, thinking about a birthday dinner check that had migrated to my side of the table, thinking about Christmas presents with someone else's name on them, thinking about the word ungenerous applied to me by the man whose freelance income I had been quietly subsidizing for 2 years. I didn't say any of that. I said, "I hear you," and I watched the exit signs pass and I made a decision that had been forming for a long time without a name. The next morning was a Sunday. My husband went to play golf with a friend. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a cup of coffee and I worked for 3 hours. I drafted a message to his mother, polite, specific, no accusations. I outlined the costs I had absorbed over the past 18 months. I noted which ones I considered gifts and which ones had been framed as loans or temporary coverage. I attached a simple accounting. I said I would love to discuss the Oregon trip budget openly and proportionally, and that going forward, I would need all shared expenses agreed upon in writing before any charges were made. Then I called my financial advisor back, and I finished what we had started. I separated my direct deposit. I opened an individual account I had not had since before the marriage, not because I was leaving, because I was done with the arrangement where my income was the floor everyone stood on, and my name was the last one mentioned when anyone said, "Thank you." I did not tell my husband before I sent the email. I warned him once, at that dinner table in front of everyone, and he had spent the drive home explaining to me why I was the problem. He had used his chance. The response from his mother came 48 hours later. It was long. It was hurt. It talked about family values and sacrifice and how she had never expected this from me. It said she couldn't believe I was keeping score. It said good families don't operate with spreadsheets. It said she thought she knew me. I read it twice and replied once, briefly, and confirmed that I had received it and that I would be happy to discuss any specific line items if she had questions about the accounting. Then I waited. The waiting was the part I hadn't expected to feel so clean. My husband came home from golf and found me reading in the living room, and I told him I had sent his mother an email. I told him what it said. I watched his face move through several things in about 4 seconds. He asked why I hadn't talked to him first. I said I had at the dinner table, and he had called it weird. He said this was different. I asked how. He didn't have an answer for that. What came next was a week of noise from his family's direction and silence from mine. His mother called him every day. His sister sent me a long text about family loyalty that I read once and did not answer. His aunt, who I had met maybe 6 times in 4 years, sent me a Facebook message that I found almost impressive in its audacity. My husband oscillated. Some nights he was angry with me. Some nights he sat on the couch and looked like a man who had been handed a map to a place he didn't recognize. A few times he tried to explain his mother to me, her history, her grief, her generation, the way she grew up. I listened. I understand context. Context doesn't write a check. The resolution, when it came, was quieter than I expected. His mother did not want to go to court. I had been careful to document everything not out of vengeance, but because documentation is just good record keeping, and I had always been good at my job. When my friend from law school sent a brief professional letter on my behalf, Not threatening, just clarifying the nature of the transfers and the existing documentation. The calls to my husband became less frequent almost immediately. 2 weeks later, a Venmo payment arrived from his mother's account. The memo field said, "Clearing up." The amount was not everything. It was enough that I knew she understood. The rest was now a matter of record. The Oregon trip did not happen. His sister planned a smaller version without us. I hope they had a good time. I mean that without sarcasm. My husband and I are still married. That might surprise some people. It surprised me a little. But what happened between us after all of it was the first honest conversation we had had in probably 2 years. Not comfortable, not easy. The kind of honest where you stop managing the other person's reaction and just say the actual thing. He admitted he had known about more than he let on. He admitted he had hoped I would keep absorbing it because it was easier than having the fight with his mother. He admitted that, on some level, he had confused my capability with my consent. That last one took him a while to find the words for. When he did, I believed him. We are in counseling now, not the performative kind that people do to say they tried. The kind where someone asks you questions you don't have preloaded answers for, and you have to sit in the discomfort of that. It is slow and sometimes discouraging, and occasionally it is exactly what it's supposed to be. His mother and I have a different relationship now, not warm, not hostile, transactional, in the way that all honest relationships are transactional once you remove the performance. She knows what I will and will not do. I know who she is when she thinks no one's watching the account balance. There is a clarity to it that I find genuinely easier to live with than the warmth that used to cost me $1,000 a month. I go back sometimes to that moment at the dinner table when she raised her glass and said Oregon would not be happening without me. I think about what she meant by that and what she didn't realize she was revealing. She meant it as a compliment. She meant it as enrollment. She meant it as a public ceiling placed over my ability to say no. What she didn't account for was that I was sitting right there, listening. People who see your resources and not your limits will always mistake your silence for agreement. I made that mistake for a long time. I let my competence become a reason to ask more of me. I let my income become a family planning tool. I let the fear of being seen as difficult keep me agreeable past the point of honesty. I don't do that anymore. Entitlement doesn't announce itself. It arrives slowly in requests that sound like trust and assumptions that wear the face of love. The only thing that stops it is the moment you decide that being easy to work with and being easy to take from are not the same thing. I decided. I keep coming back to that dinner table. The pot roast, the warm lighting, 12 people laughing over each other, and my mother-in-law standing up with her glass raised, saying my name like it was a gift she was giving me, when really she was closing a door I hadn't realized was being shut. That's the thing about being taken from slowly. It doesn't feel like theft. It feels like love, like family, like being needed, and those feelings are not easy to argue with. I was good at my job, I was organized, I made things happen. And somewhere along the way, those qualities became a reason to ask more of me, rather than a reason to thank me. My competence was treated like a resource instead of a choice. What I had to learn, and it took longer than I like to admit, was that the way you respond to the first ask teaches people how to make the second one. I said yes to the car registration. I said yes to the AC repair. I absorbed the birthday dinner and the Christmas gifts and the beach house deposit, and every time I did, I was teaching the people around me that my boundaries were suggestions, not walls. That's not their fault entirely. That's on me. I handed them the blueprint. The intelligence I thought I had, the spreadsheets and the budgets and the careful tracking, it wasn't protecting me because I wasn't using it honestly. I knew something was wrong months before I let myself say so. I kept softening the numbers in my head, rounding down the discomfort, telling myself it wasn't that bad. She's grieving. He doesn't mean it. This is just what family costs. Smart people can talk themselves into a lot of damage when they're motivated to avoid a hard conversation. What finally changed wasn't anger. Anger would have made me loud, and loud was not what that situation needed. What changed was clarity. The kind that settles in when you stop trying to make an unfair arrangement feel fair and just look at it for what it is. $11,000. 18 months. A man who confused my capability with my consent. A woman who had learned that my silence meant yes. Once I saw it clearly, I stopped needing anyone else to see it the same way. I didn't need my mother-in-law to admit what she'd done. I didn't need my husband to be outraged on my behalf. I needed to act, and act in a way I could live with, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. There's a real difference between those two things, and I think it matters which one you're operating from. The hard part wasn't the email, it wasn't separating the accounts or calling the lawyer. The hard part was deciding that I was worth the disruption, that my comfort, my financial security, my sense of being treated fairly inside my own marriage, those things were worth the discomfort of a week of difficult conversations and a mother-in-law who stopped calling for a while. They were. I am. And I didn't need anyone at that table to raise a glass to me to know it.